Welcome. Thank you for your patience. I know it is hard to get around DC today. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. On behalf of Jane Harmon, I'm Andrew Seeley. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Jane Harmon is away today, but I get the great honor of welcoming you here and welcoming Dr. Kaberuka here to the Wilson Center. He is, well, I'll introduce him in a moment. Let me say the Wilson Center, for those of you that are unfamiliar with us, was created in 1968 by an act of Congress. Unlike physical monuments in the nation's capital, it's a living memorial whose work and scholarship commemorate the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. Today, we provide a trusted political space where the worlds of policy and scholarship interact through public events, as well as timely and relevant research to address critical, current, and emerging challenges confronting the United States and the world. We have a particular commitment to Africa and U.S. relations with Africa. Dr. Monde Muyangwa, who you'll hear from in a moment, actually leads our efforts on Africa, and it is one of the central pillars of what we do here at the Wilson Center. Today's discussion focuses on Africa's transformation, which has been characterized by rapid and sustained economic growth over the last decade. Today, many African economies continue to expand at a rapid pace with a growth of 4.5% in 2014, and it's projected to rise to 5.1% this year. Discoveries of energy resources, access to emerging markets, infrastructure development, and increases in private investment offer new opportunities for growth. And in addition to that, since 2000, global foreign direct investment stock in sub-Saharan Africa has increased dramatically from over $33.5 billion to $246.4 billion in 2012. We were just speaking about this briefly. I mean, this is a number of businesses are looking very closely at Africa right now as a potential for investment that weren't looking 15 years ago. The African Development Bank has been a major actor in this transformation, and today it has an active portfolio of $25 billion, some two-thirds of which is spent on infrastructure. Yet there are many challenges that remain. Foreign direct investment flows into sub-Saharan Africa are highly concentrated in only a few countries, and while the percentage of people living under poverty line has decreased, which is very positive, Africa remains the poorest continent in the world, home to approximately 75% of the world's poorest countries. The question is how best to capitalize on and expand upon the growth we've seen and translated into opportunities for sustainable development on the continent. Before I turn it over to Dr. Muyangwa, who will moderate the session, let me introduce to you Dr. Donald Kaberuka, our speaker today. He really needs no introduction. I think everyone in this room knows well who he is. He has an illustrious career, but let me say he's been at the helm of the African Development Bank since 2005. He's widely respected in Africa and globally for his leadership and contributions to Africa. Many have acknowledged the key role that he has played as president of the bank in helping to consolidate Africa's transformation and to position Africa as a continent for the future. It is perhaps no coincidence that the period of growth in Africa has coincided with his leadership. Under his leadership, the bank has become a key player in fostering trade and investment, reducing poverty, and enhancing sustainable development. The bank has also become Africa's premier financial institution during this period. Before joining the African Development Bank, Dr. Kaberuka has a distinguished career in banking, international trade and development, and government service. A national of Rwanda, he was the country's Minister of Finance and Economic Planning between 1997 and 2005, where he oversaw Rwanda's successful economic reconstruction after the end of the civil war there. Dr. Kaberuka was educated at universities in Tanzania and Scotland, and he holds a PhD in economics from Glasgow University. He is preparing to leave office in May 2015. We're at the end of his second term, and we've asked him to share his reflections on Africa's accomplishments, its current challenges, and opportunities for the future regarding trade, investment, and development throughout the continent, and the role of African-led and multilateral organizations in this effort. Dr. Kaberuka, I invite you to the microphone. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be at the Wilson Center, so I want to thank you, Vice President, and Dr. Muyangwa for the kind invitation. I have not been here before.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here. Now, the topic I've been given says the role of the MDBs, Multilateral Development Banks, in the promotion of trade and investment in Africa, I suppose. Right. So I want to concentrate on that issue narrowly. And I want to make a couple of propositions, none of which I think is controversial. First, I want to suggest that, as I was saying yesterday at another center, for a long time, Africa was seen as an exotic market. A place you go to once you've been to Latin America, to Asia, to Eastern Europe, and then you look for something to do on the continent. It was deemed to be risky. And the risks were real. These were mainly policy-related, nationalization, macroeconomic instability. So the risk in the political area. Now, I think since probably the turn of the millennium, those risks are still there, but they have declined. But now we face a new set of risks. And that's where I think, I want to suggest that the multilateral banks need to put down the emphasis. Risk number one is in the cost of doing business area. And that cost of doing business can be summed up as infrastructure, as government, small markets fragmented, and so on. So that is the first issue to address. The second one is a risk in the area of regulation. So for example, people want to invest in energy. What will be hampering them is not lack of finance or lack of knowledge, is that the institutional framework, regulation around the energy sector is wanting. So as far as I'm concerned, that is where the African Development Bank is putting an emphasis at the moment. Now, going forward though, here's my take, and I'm leaving office next month, so I know what my successors will do, but I do think the emphasis now should be on the following 4 areas. Area number one is to actually support countries fund their own development. 50 years after independence, it just cannot be right that countries like yours or many others have to go looking for other people's taxes to pay for their development. So that should be number one. And there are many ways of doing it. We can discuss that today. There will be in the areas of domestic resource mobilization, better management of natural resources, getting fair price for those resources, sound financial management, and a whole range of things. I think this soft approach to development strikes me now as absolutely vital. A country like yours, Dr. Myango, has no business looking for further post-taxation. Now, there will be a few countries, though, as President Obama was saying in Cape Town, which we still need some support for some time. The like of Central African Republic and others, but those are few in between. I want to suggest that the second thing which international financial institutions must do is again to figure out how to mobilize Africa's own savings and utilize those savings to build a continent for the future. It's astounding if you look at the total amount of pools of savings available, long-term pools of savings on the continent. And as a young continent, we don't have challenges which richer countries face in terms of liabilities and assets, say for pension funds and things like that. I want to suggest the third thing we need to focus upon is how to figure out how to go around the colonial heritage, 54 countries, into one single market. What the Europeans have done, and what you have done here with Canada and Mexico. I was saying to you in your office, something which some friends of mine are working upon. Because far too often, people look at Africa as 54 countries, and will ask you, which country is doing better than the next one? I think it is not a particularly useful approach. A particularly useful approach for me would be, imagine Africa, just close your eyes, imagine there are no borders. I know it is an artificial construct, but just imagine. Then figure out where the cities, where the towns, we're looking at anything above 500,000 people, and connect them with a line. Now imagine you're a business person, say you're investing money, say in Lagos. The chances are I'll be interested in the markets in Cotonou, in Benin next door, maybe even in Ghana next door, than maybe in the state of Borno, this and Nigeria. So you can take a construct which like the maps is there now, or actually asking the question, but where is the market? And the chances are, because of the economics of agglomeration, these markets will be in those cities, in the towns. This is where things are happening now. Now, if we have an African Development Bank or even the World Bank, which concentrates in these areas, cost of doing business, helping countries mobilize their own money, catalyze private investment, do the single market, that would already be quite a big agenda. That then be the next question. The next big question is, I'm referring to one of your colleagues at Brookings, Johannes Lin, I think. He wrote an article, I don't recall the year, probably 2013 or 2012, I don't know. And he said something which I found extremely fascinating. He said, these international financial institutions, World Bank or ourselves, were put in place under two assumptions, geopolitical assumptions, which are no longer valid. Geopolitical assumption number one, that you have something called the East and the West. Geopolitical assumption number two, there's something called the North and the South. The North is rich, the South is poor. So resources will flow from North to South, and so on. But now, as we sit here today in 2015, the world is very much different. The North, the South, the East and West are meaningless constructs. And so probably the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions have to reinvent themselves of how to function in this new world. And so I want to suggest that while they have done quite well, all of us, World Bank 60 years, we 50 years, both in normal times, in crisis times, being counter-cyclical, they have sometimes even acted like a glue in an international financial architecture which is disarticulated. Now it is time to reinvent themselves. Some, like the EBRD, has actually accomplished its mission. It was put in place to help former Eastern European countries transit to the market economy. That mission is accomplished, almost. So we need to figure out what to do now together. Now, people will tell me that these institutions have been changing, perhaps too slowly. It is true. But I do think, as Johannes Lin said, it's time to figure out how to work in this new environment. Let me give you an example of your own country, Dr. Nyang. Zambia was one of the first few countries to go to the capital markets to borrow money. The amount of money they borrowed, that was, I don't know, 6%, I've forgotten, was a multiple of what we and the World Bank can give. So all these countries now, even some of the poorer ones, have alternatives. So if they can mobilize their own domestic markets, if they can go to the capital markets and borrow money, they actually can leverage several times over what to do. So it means, going forward, I think the model of these institutions as purveyors of a closed envelope full of money to fund development is over. It's now time to say, how do we use this money we have to leverage private capital, of which there is plenty? I'll give you some numbers just now. I don't know if they're right, but they'll be wrong, a couple of dollars, but roughly. In the year 2013, if you take total development aid to sub-Saharan Africa, so coming from international financial institutions, bilaterals and so on, it was about $55 billion, $55 billion, no more. Now, if you look at foreign direct investment, in the same year, $82 billion. But now here's a catch for you. If you look at the amount of money they themselves have mobilized from their own internal resources, $500 billion. So money coming from international financial institutions, bilateral donors, is now a very small fraction of what they need for development. And I've looked at the number of countries which have gone to the markets last year. I think there are about 8 of them, no, 7 of them. They were able to borrow close to $8.5 billion. So these countries now have alternatives. And I dare to think that actually, if we could do something on illicit flows, these over-invoicing, mispricing, this kind of stuff, and if we could do something about this race to the bottom in terms of tax incentives, actually many of these countries could fund their own development much more effectively than they do now. Because if you add up all these tax incentives as countries compete for investment, illicit flows, huge amounts of money. Tax incentives alone, for 2012, the last year for which I have the numbers, for some countries could be as high as 2% of GDP. 2% of GDP. So companies coming, look, I'm going to invest in this sector, give me tax holidays, all right? And so countries compete with each other. They give them tax holidays. First of all, very ineffective. But also you can see 2% of GDP is a lot of money. Now, you and I know that throughout history, nations have been poor, that moved on through two things: tapping into capital markets and tapping into global trade. So I do believe that the challenge now for the African Development Bank will be how to help these countries mobilize their own resources, as I've mentioned, domestic savings, deal with cost of doing business, and then assist countries better tap into capital markets and trade. Now, I want to conclude, since you and I want to have a conversation, to say that in the past, IFIs, MDBs as you call them, have been quite effective at different times in terms of resources, in terms of policies, delivery capabilities. But now they have to reinvent themselves. If they do not invent themselves, my guess is over time they lose their own franchise value. In other words, countries have alternatives and they'll be looking for different things to do. But as you can see, we still have quite a big agenda. Now for us, what I've done in the bank was to focus on this area of cost of doing business. We do focus on infrastructure, not because it's a sectoral choice. Infrastructure is a means to an end, and the means to an end means trade. The services flowing from infrastructure. Number two, we focused on the single market. Number three, we focused on these countries coming out of conflict, sometimes called the fragile states. And finally, on promotion of the private sector. I don't think this agenda will change, but I think it has to evolve to bear in mind the changes which have happened in the world. So, let me sum up. Number one, I do not think that you would disagree that Africa is no longer an exotic market. It's a market where you go, you make money, you lose money, like anywhere else. It's about risk mitigation. But the risks remain in terms of cost of doing business, broadly defined. So that has to be addressed. Number two, in this highly fragmented market, it's very important that we focus on how to create a single market where the issue now is no longer tariffs, it's more the non-tariff issues, free circulation of people. Second, help countries mobilize their own resources, of which there is plenty. Third, help countries mobilize domestic savings, long-term pools of savings. Thirdly, create a single market. And finally, address these pockets of fragile states, of which every continent has some. Some have Ukraine, we have Afghanistan, maybe Syria, we have a few of our own. And those have huge effects on the neighborhood, and they impose a huge cost on the neighbors. So I do hope that going forward, this is what MDBs will do, whether it's the World Bank or the regional banks, because the world is changing very, very fast. And these institutions are what, 50 years?
Yes.
In the case of the World Bank, over 60 years. Now, when you are 60 years, begin to look at life differently as you prepare for retirement. Now, there's a choice between retirement and the reinvention. And I hope that the institutions can reinvent themselves. So, thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaberuka, for what I thought was a very candid discussion about where Africa is today. But more importantly, I think you made some very interesting point about the future, the vision for a future Africa and where Africa needs to go and the key issues that African countries and African multilateral organizations need to address, but also international ones. But I want to focus on Africa's responsibility because I think international partners can bring value added, but Africa must be in the driving seat in order to realize some of these changes that you are talking about. I'm glad you started with this issue of the risk perception. And I want to dig a little bit more into that. It seems to me that there's a lot of some myth and some reality around the political and economic risks of doing business in Africa. I think externally, there's still this sense of the unacceptably high levels of risk of doing business in Africa. People look at the issue of corruption, with so many African countries, in terms of the corruption indexed, so many African countries still clustered in the very high levels of that index. The lack of infrastructure, even though we must say the African Development Bank and others have made commendable efforts over the last 10 years to address this infrastructure issue. Political instability in some countries. You mentioned the Central African Republic, but also the fact that when you look at conflict, 9 of 16 United Nations peacekeeping missions are in Africa. And for good or bad, a lot of people still tend to conflate Africa into one place. You know, there's Ebola in West Africa, people think there's Ebola everywhere on the continent. There's conflict in some countries, then the entire African conflict is conflict-ridden. So that does get in the way of how people assess the levels of risk. And I think my question to you is, what role has the African Development Bank played in tackling these issues? One, to bring a much more realistic assessment of what the actual risk is, but two, to address those structural and systemic issues that actually underpin what is very real risk in some countries and in some areas. And how successful do you think the bank has been, and what else can the bank do?
First of all, I think that the Arabs have a saying that you can't hide the sun with your fingers. So there are risks in Africa. There are issues, those you mentioned. But I want to suggest, though, that frankly, talking about corruption, if you take African countries and Russia, we're in the 4th league. I'm not saying that there should be corruption anywhere, but I'm saying that the perception that Africa is there for corruption ignores a lot of progress made over the last 20 years. Enormous. Civil society is stronger, institutions are stronger, and they're able to prevent and deal with those governance failures. Now, the real risk we have is one I've just mentioned, that we have 54 fragmented markets. It's as if the United States, how many states are here in the US? 40 something. Just imagine that each of them was a country. Just think, stop and think. With their rules, with their systems, with their currencies, it's a huge cost for business. And so for us, the first thing we want to focus upon is to say, okay, you have the reality of these political entities, but how do you actually figure out how to have one market, at least 5 regional markets, the 5 regions of Africa. We're making a lot of progress. Tariffs no longer an issue, but non-tariff added an issue. Yeah, every business person will tell you that. Now, as for political instability, my take is that you have nasty situations around the Central African Republic. You have the Sudan, South Sudan. But the real risk we are facing in that area now is international terrorism. Whether you describe them as Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, or some other versions of it, that is real, the risk we face. And the problem is, as you know very well, this is a phenomenon which African countries cannot handle on their own, because the phenomenon is broader than the African continent. So I think we can handle the other issues you mentioned. Look, the African Bank was headquartered in Cote d'Ivoire. We had to flee for 11 years because there was a crisis in the country. So I can't deny that we still have residual instability. But I think we're learning to handle that. If you don't believe me, Just imagine a month ago what people were saying about Nigeria. How many doomsday scenarios were drawn about Nigeria because an election was coming? An election. But because there is this perception about elections in Africa always go wrong, people had already drawn a scenario. Then there's an election. One president wins, another loses, he concedes. Next day, Nigeria is back. Now, my sense is Nigeria will never be the same from now. There will be issues to handle, but Nigeria will never be the same. I think the die is cast. There will be issues to handle. But for Nigerians to handle Boko Haram in the north, or Kenya to handle issues of Al-Shabaab, or some other nasty characters in the Sahel, that requires international cooperation. But now to sum up about your question about real and perceived risk, partly our own failures, frankly. We have not done sufficient explanation, including accepting things when they are wrong in our own countries, and how we deal with them, blaming foreigners, blaming external forces, instead of actually focusing on dealing with those issues. But we have paid a high price because of the difference between real risk and perceived risk. And that premium reflecting the way the markets charge the African countries, borrow money and so on. But I do believe that those things have evolved significantly towards the positive side, I think, over the last 20 years.
I appreciate the fact that you are so direct and willing to also take some serious introspection on what the continent has done right and perhaps areas where the continent needs to make improvements. My second question to you has to do with one of the primary missions of the African Development Bank, which is to improve the lives of ordinary African citizens. If we look at how the issue of poverty has played out over the last 20 years, I think it would be fair to say that yes, there has been some reduction in levels of poverty on the African continent, but not nearly enough. The needle has only moved so much. So from your perspective, why is it that poverty reduction has remained so stubborn on the continent? What can multilateral organizations do to be more effective in this area so that we can reduce the numbers significantly?
That is an easy one. I think that it's important not to confuse economic growth with economic transformation. They are two different things. Economic growth refers to the expansion of the cake. Economic transformation is about the changing the structure of the economy. Now, that is the challenge for almost every part of our continent. I think the only country where I could say with the hand on my heart that they are beginning to make a huge headway is Ethiopia. You have to go to Addis and you will see what I think are the seeds of transformation. I'm not saying they are there. I'm only saying that they are beginning to make progress. And you can see in the numbers on poverty, they have almost brought down poverty by half in only a decade and a half, where they're creating jobs and so on and so forth. So it's a challenge. But the reason poverty is not coming down fast enough in other countries is, first of all, that one. The second one is demographics. Just think for a country like Niger, where the birth rate is 3.9%, one of the highest in the world. So if you have got economic growth at 5%, frankly, you have to be doing this maybe for over 40 years. So combine demographics with the fact that 5% growth might look like it is a strong number, but it's actually very, very low. Many of these countries which have transformed have had to do double-digit growth for quite some time, or something close to it. 9%, 8%, 7%. But below 70%, you'd be struggling for quite a long time. So the challenge of going from 5 to 7% and above comes back to poor infrastructure, lack of energy, fragmented markets. So that is the first challenge. So you have economic growth, which is strong, but below what we need. The fact that you begin from a low base, you have demographics in some countries, and lack of transformation. Combine all that together, you can see that we still have a long, long way to go.
I'll ask one more question before I turn it over to the audience, because I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions for you as well. U.S.-Africa relations, especially economic engagement. First question, from your perspective, how does U.S.-Africa engagement compare with other major international actors in Africa? And what are the biggest challenge that you see in that the biggest challenge that you see in the relationship between U.S. and Africa at the economic level? And how would you like to see U.S.-Africa relations transform?
Thank you. No, yesterday I paid homage to what President Bush did in his administration, which was to really focus on some of these big health issues on the continent. I mean, PEPFAR was a success by any imagination. And President Bush didn't have to do this. I don't think he had political capital here to promote this program. So that was a relationship which worked brilliantly well, contributing to the decline and death of children, the decline of HIV/AIDS. So that was something to be proud of. Now, President Obama has taken that to the next level, which is to say, some bits of Africa will still require humanitarian aid, will require assistance in the fragile states. But what Africa is looking for now from the United States is a relationship around trade and investment. And so the question then should be, what does it take to make that happen? And this is why now we, the US government, US institutions, are focusing upon. What does it take to increase the share of trade investments of African business in American business in Africa? I think Power Africa was such an opportunity because Africa needs power. All these countries are having issues with electricity. Talk about poverty, energy poverty is still a major issue. Now, in terms of the financial resources needed to close the gap, actually, they are trivial, so to speak. But we need to figure out how to get the policy environment right for companies to invest in energy production as independent power producers. And Power Africa was supposed to make that happen. So you have countries in Africa sorting out the policy nexus, and then we attract private businesses like General Electric, Symbion, and others to invest in production of power. So we're looking for that kind of relationships, which with good policies, you attract businesses. I do not buy the view at all that there's a competition in Africa between old powers and new emerging powers. I think Africans are mature enough to know what they want. And Africans are looking for opportunities, wherever they come from, north, south, east. So we welcome Brazilian companies, Turkish companies, Chinese companies, Malaysian companies, as we do for companies from the US and the north. The notion that somehow there's a race for Africa is interesting for newspapers. But I think beyond that, the reality shows that there is room for all of us to work together to close the gaps in areas such as infrastructure.
Let me now open it up for questions, but first, rules of engagement. We have a very short window, and so I'd like to get in as many questions as we can for Dr. Kaberuka, so I'll take 3 questions. Please identify yourself. We will bring a mic to you. Identify yourself, the organization that you're affiliated with, and ask a question in under 1 minute. We will take 3 questions and then turn the mic over to Dr. Kaberuka. So I'll start in the back there. the two gentlemen in the back, and I'll work my way up front, the lady here.
Thank you, Dr. Kabir. Yes, my question will be for American investors, stuff like that.
And who are you, sir?
I'm Abdi Shifa.
Okay.
And so my question is there enough room in the continent of Africa for American investors now? Because I traveled to Ethiopia after 15 or 20 years absence. When I went there, I couldn't find myself in the city where I live because the development was booming. But in the meantime, like the Chinese, the BRICS country especially, are involving there heavily. So I believe America is way behind in that investment sector because too long we spend on aid. We were advocating here like, please, investment is much better than any aid in Africa because how I saw was like...
My brother, I'm looking at you.
Okay.
Get to your question, sir.
Okay, you mentioned about the failed states like South Sudan and Central Africa. Now you forgot to mention about Somalia. The Somalian problem is a big problem in Africa itself because it's sad to see 147 Kenyans died last time, but we are dealing with a symptom. How can we help to establish a Somalian government to be strong, to deal with its problem? Because it's a celebration about Nigeria also. I'm thankful for that.
Thank you so much, my brother, but please get to your question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Kwasi Bosompem. I'm a city planner here and also with Let's Go Africa Foundation. Dr. Kabir, you laid much emphasis on the infrastructure, which I like that. What has the bank really done in terms of facilitating adequate infrastructure set up in Africa? Just as we're speaking, the Chinese are rolling out the mass transit in Addis Ababa on their own. In South Africa, you've seen what has happened in the fast trains and what is in the Maputo corridor and others. Has there been any leverage whereby the bank has seen a lot of moving private capital to get involved in infrastructure development in Africa? Yeah.
It was up here. Two up.
Thanks, Dr. Kaberuka. My name is Marcia Cota. I work for an environmental NGO called RARE. We're just starting a new project in Mozambique, and I'm from Brazil, so I've worked a lot in Brazil, and I thought there was something missing from your presentation when we talk about all this economic growth trajectory and development that's coming to Africa at 5% now and hopefully 7% later. Normally, when we talk about development, economic growth, normally these come at a high cost to biodiversity, to the environment, to overexploitation of natural resource. So I would like to hear from you what the bank is thinking about that, what are their approach and other important stakeholders to avoid, the collapse of, let's say, fisheries, and increased, poverty levels for people that depend heavily on natural resource and the impact that all these growth can have on natural resource and biodiversity and the environment. Thanks.
So Dr. Kaberuka, 3 questions for you, sir.
Yes, but I didn't understand the first question. I must apologize.
I think the first question had to do with how we can help build government in Somalia, because absent that whole Horn of Africa area is going to be a tough neighborhood with implications for development and other issues.
I wish I had an answer, honestly. I can't sit here and pretend that I have an answer for Somalia. Yes, 3 things as a reflection. Number 1, that there might have been a Somali crisis maybe in the 90s, but now it has transformed into something else. It's a problem of international terrorism. And so if you're looking for an internal solution without involving international cooperation, I think it will be very difficult. some of these shababs, or even some of the terrorist people I've seen in the Sahel, don't even speak African languages. People don't know where they come from. So we must distinguish international terrorism and some of the local crises we have to deal with. I want to pay homage to the African forces in Somalia. The Kenyans are there, Ugandans, the Burundians, the Ethiopians, and many others, trying to help the country stabilize. And I wish they had more support to enable them to achieve their purpose. But at the end of the day, Somalis will have to sit together and find a solution for their own country. But I think we should distinguish three problems: international terrorism and domestic issues, which Somalis will have to find a solution. And I'm hoping that the AU forces in there can receive assistance from outside. But if you're looking for a magic answer from me, I don't have any. Now, on infrastructure, I think if any institution has gone out of its way to focus on infrastructure, it is us, with the limited means we have. 60% of all our operations. We're the biggest investor in energy in Africa, both from the public sector side and private sector side. In every single country, in energy interconnections. And they will look at it, it's not so much our money, it is how much each dollar I put out there can leverage private capital. And we think it's anywhere between 1 to 5, 1 to 6. Yeah. But still the needs of Africa are so huge that the idea that there's competition with the Chinese and Brazilians and Americans is absolutely anachronistic. There's need for all types of investment in all forms of energy, because bring me to the second question. Our strategy for 10 years is called a strategy for inclusion in the green economy. We're firm believers in the green economy because Africa has plenty of it. Whether it is blue, it is green, land, marine resources, renewable energy sources, we have plenty of that. And we see opportunities in the green economy to the future. What I not accept is the idea that somehow we should have a binary choice. If a country has not enough resources in terms of renewables, then they should live in energy poverty rather than developing a dam or a coal project. That's a bedtime story. Reality is we have got plenty of renewables. We need to invest in many more, whether it's geothermal, sun, or hydro. But some countries don't have much choice and have to still rely on fossil fuels. But we're firm believers in the potential for the green economy and the blue economy as well.
I'll take 3 more very short questions because we are running behind. So I'll come to the lady up front here, and then Dr. Rotberg in the corner there. Yes, I'll come to you, madam. You'll be third.
Thanks. I'm Jennifer Bremer from Arizona State University, and I really want to thank you for your remarks. I personally would not phrase it so much as reducing operating costs as how can you increase productivity? And in that, a key question is how do you increase the ability of the workforce? And with primary schools, more or less, still a ways to go, but more or less being met, there's going to be a huge demand for secondary and, of course, tertiary. And what do you see as the role of the bank in providing that?
Dr. Rotberg? No, Dr. Rotberg in the corner there. We'll come to you later.
Thanks. Robert Rotberg, fellow here at the center. Most of African nations are corrupt. Their corrupt countries lose about 1% GDP per annum. What should and can your successor do at the African Development Bank about corruption?
Yeah, but can I take this? So I fully respect your right to make that assertion. We have a problem on our continent of handling institutional failures, and we still have issues of corruption, as you mentioned, natural resource sector, and many others. But the proposition that most African countries are corrupt is frankly preposterous. And I think many Africans here will take exception to that. We have issues of corruption. But I think I take the view that institutions have become stronger every year. The civil society has become stronger. And African citizens accept now demand of their governments that they are clean, they deliver services. Do you always succeed? No. There'll be some failures. In my own country, I'm a Rwandan. The institutions have been able to contain the issue of corruption to the extent that it's no longer the number one issue in terms of national challenges, because the institutions have become strong and they can handle it, and many others. So while we accept we still have a long way to go, I'd not accept the idea that most African countries are corrupt. Now, let me add even something else. On this issue of illicit flows, actually African countries are victims. Because illicit flows is not the same thing as capital flight as in crime. It is large companies over-invoicing, mispricing, demanding excessive tax holidays, so that you have these countries competing for investment, giving away almost a large part of the revenues. You have this issue which lawyers call transfer pricing, which means multinational corporations, doing accounting between subsidiary firms, minimizing tax liabilities, both in the country of operation and the country of origin. So I think actually, when it comes to illicit flows, African countries are huge victims. They are not the culprits. That said, I agree with you that in a number of countries, there is work to be done. It cannot be right that a country exports 1.9 million barrels of oil per day, and 60% of the people live below $1 a day. Something is definitely very wrong and has to be fixed, and that is institutions. Sorry for intervening.
No. This is very good. Would you mind also taking the question on education?
Oh, I cannot disagree with that. But here's a challenge maybe you can help us think through. With our demographics, now it's not possible for governments to have the means to provide free education to our children. We have got 50 million kids out of school. We have maybe an equivalent number in school but not learning very much because of lack of teachers, lack of teaching materials. So we need to rethink how we provide education for our children. And I would welcome very much your thoughts on how this can be done. There's room for private provision. Here in DC, you have something I like very much. I've forgotten. Something called charter schools. I've been doing some research into that, which, if I understand, is that you look at how much money you give to a particular institution in per capita terms, and you figure out how to get the private provider of services doing the same. And I think it is something I would like to look into. But I welcome very much your suggestion of what we can do to increase access and quality of education.
Yes, and just on that point, I can't help but add to it, because I really think we talk a lot about African transformation. One area where we need to focus on is how we transform Africa's educational sector. For me, that's a really big issue. I see too many countries still teaching for the Africa of today or even yesterday, rather than the Africa we want to see and what sort of skill sets children are going to have in order for Africa to compete, but also just to thrive by itself. So I think that's a really, really important question, and I'm glad you took that. Now, with your permission, so I know we've come to the end, but I can see there were several other hands. So if your schedule allows, can we tack on 10 minutes?
Let me find out from my handlers. Do I have 10 minutes? Yes, no, maybe?
10 minutes. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We're putting pressure on you. I really do appreciate that. So it's 10 minutes. You see the hands in the room, so 30 seconds to your question. The gentleman right over there, the lady in front of him, she's had a hand up for a long time.
Thank you, Dr. Kaberuka, for your presentation. I'm Dr. Duale. I'm a public health person.
Public health.
Public health. So I agree with all of your suggestion about investment in energy, reducing the cost of business. But how do you think the ADB can deal with shock like the Ebola that stopped almost all the economy in West Africa? The shock of disease.
You mentioned the role of the private sector and the bank's ability to leverage those private capital dollars. My name is Vicki McPherson. I'm at the law firm Greenberg Traurig, and we work throughout the continent. And one of the things that we see is the role of English law dominating across the continent. What role do you see as the multilateral banks in pushing to bring, whether it's OHADA or some other particular country's law, into the role of the governing law? What do you see will be the triggers for that as you move forward, and is it appropriate and desirable?
The question, gentleman in the middle there. And then
Thank you,
I'll come to
Dr.
it. I'll take
Tim LaBelle, USAID. I'd like to know what the bank is doing to support the RECs, the regional economic communities, ECOWAS, the East African community, and others, to facilitate better trade on a regional basis. Thank you.
I'll take one more, make an exception. The lady there has had her hand up for a very long time.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kaberuka, Dr. Muyango. My name is Barbara Gonga. I'm a PhD student at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. I just want to touch on two issues that you have brought to attention this morning. One of them is the cost of doing business. And the next one is the common market. On the cost of doing business, what is the bank doing in terms of helping countries, to bring in regulations when industries are setting? And I think this is one of the problems that many countries are experiencing. If you find out that we are getting a lot of Chinese coming in, and like countries like America are not coming in, basically because the industries are not regulated. How is the bank contributing towards that, and what is the help it's giving? And the second one is the common market. The common market is not a new thing in African countries. There was this very famous East African community, and the OAU is one form of the common market that was attempted, but they were systematically destroyed by the African leadership themselves. So how have you been able to go back and look at the lessons and see what are some of the factors that destroyed those institutions before we start talking about setting up new common market?
All right, Dr. Kaberuka. Question on the AfDB and Ebola. Dominance of English law, AfDB support to the regional economic communities, and then a two-part question on the cost of doing business and the common market. And is this old wine or new wine in old?
First of all, let me pick up the one on laws. I'm not a lawyer. So maybe you and I can have bilateral later, because in Africa they have so many legal systems. I think we have those who follow the common law, you have those who follow the Napoleonic law, I think, or called civil code, I think. We even have a third one called the Roman Dutch in South Africa and Namibia. But I don't think that is a major impediment in promoting things like OHADA. Because irrespective of the legal system, we can still do harmonization of how things are done. That is true that the OHADA is limited to the Francophone countries. But for example, in East Africa, where there's common law, they are trying to do the same. So I don't think the impediment is so much the legal system inherited. I think the impediment is something else, probably in the area of institutions themselves. But to be honest with you, my legal knowledge is limited to what my son tells me, who is a lawyer. So I don't know if the answer I'm giving is the right one, but we can have a bilateral so you can educate me a bit more on what we can do in that domain. Now, regional economic communities. We have made a lot of headway in supporting the regional economic communities. We have made headway in terms of tariffs. We have made headway in terms of harmonization of systems, such as the payment systems when the currencies are different. We have made a lot of headway in terms of interconnection of power, for example. We have made less progress on free movement of people. And that is absolutely vital. Because at the end of the day, you can build highways, you can do all these institutions, but if there's no movement of people, capital, harmonization of services, it's a wasted opportunity. We would like to promote more Schengen-type arrangements, where a tourist visiting Zambia does not have to get a visa to go to Zimbabwe, to Malawi. East Africans are making good progress there. But as you know, looking at the Europeans, economic integration is never easy for two reasons, because some politicians still think it is a zero-sum game. You win, I lose. And we're trying to show that actually there are benefits to be gained by working together. I think a second problem is the one someone mentioned, history. The East African community in the 70s was far more advanced than anything Europeans have today. But it fell apart because of political realities of the time. Now they're trying to bring it back. It is slow, but the progress is quite good. Now, but let me come to the critical issue of Ebola, which, thank God, we're beginning to see the end of it. I think three things failed. The first thing which failed was the international response. I think the international response to Ebola was a disaster. Why? Because this was a virus in a remote part of Africa of no threat to the world, until it became a threat to the world. But I think the international architecture for responding to epidemics today has to be refixed. Because we don't know what will be the next epidemic, what it will be, where it will come from. But as we are now 7 billion people, as our numbers increase, we're competing with other species. Nature is feeling the pinch, so we have to be prepared to deal with epidemics. So that is international response. Now, in terms of we in Africa, it has demonstrated that we have absolutely now to work harder to rebuild the public primary health care. I was saying yesterday at Brookings that Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone are some of the most fragile parts of our continent because of this dreadful over 10 years. But as soon as the virus went to Senegal, because the Senegalese have got the basic health care, they're able to contain it. As soon as the virus entered Lagos, it was contained. In Mali, it was contained. So we have a lot of work to do to try and rebuild primary health care. And that is not a rocket science. It's not the same as building big hospitals for complex pathologies, but we have to work together to do that. So we are helping in that area. Second is to build Africa's own capacity at disease prevention and epidemic management. And my colleague, Dr. Zuma, was here, I think last week, speaking to Secretary Kerry about how we can work with the US and other institutions to build that capacity in our regions. It was a dreadful epidemic. We ourselves put quite a lot of money behind it, but it was after the event to enable governments do what governments are supposed to do. But I would like to emphasize what I think was double damage done by the failure of international response. Number one, mechanisms were not in place. Number two, you had these doomsday scenarios, which actually delayed the response. So I remember looking at a program, I don't know which TV or the CNN or something, talk about 1 million people likely to die. So health workers who are willing to go to help, of course, they're human beings. So I do think that we need to sit together and figure out how to be prepared for the next epidemic globally, not simply within the African continent alone. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I do have to bring this to an end, and I apologize to everyone who didn't get a chance to speak or to ask their questions. Dr. Kaberuka, on behalf of the Wilson Center leadership, I thank you for taking time from, I know what is a very busy schedule, to come here and speak with us. And I'd ask the audience to please join me in thanking Dr. Kaberuka for his time. But I will also say to you, and I'm going to go African on you now, I think you're considered a son of the soil, and you know what that means. So we hope that as your term comes to an end, whatever it is that you choose to do, that passion for Africa, that passion for providing a leadership voice on key issues that impact the continent will stay with you, and that you will continue to work Africa issues.
Absolutely.
So, sir, we thank you, and we wish you well.
Thank you.
And let me give you my